It's not every day that you experience something that changes who you are. It's really not. It's maybe one conversation. It may be something very medial. Well, for me, it was one conversation. One simple conversation changed the entirety of my life. And it was a conversation, in fact, I had with Cliff at Bible camp. I had been studying for some time, I guess on my own. I really had never studied with anybody one-on-one. And I'd been studying on my own for some period of time. And I had also been a cabin counselor at Bible camp in 2012. And I remember having conversations with preachers then, and I remember having conversations with preachers in 2013. Well, I went on this little road trip in the middle of Bible camp with Tyler Kirkpatrick, which most of you know who that is, and we went to pick up a friend who was flying into the Fresno airport from Tennessee. And we're driving down, and Cheyenne's with me in the car, and Tyler's there. We're having a conversation, and we get to the airport, and we pick her up, and we're on our way back, and we're driving up a hill. And they said something to the effect, I think I was driving a little crazy, and I said, well, at least if you die, you know where you're going. At least if you die, you know you're going to heaven. And Tyler turns around and he asks me a question, well, where are you going? And it wasn't later that night that Cliff sat me down on a bench and gave me a conversation. He said, look, Nick, he said, you just need to do it. You know what you need to do? You know how to be, what you need to do to become a Christian? You just need to do it. You need to stop letting things stop you from becoming a Christian. Because for me, it was, well, I had maybe some bad habits, and I did some things that weren't really Christ-like, and I thought that I had to be perfect. I thought that I had to change everything about who I was before I was a Christian. A single conversation changed my life. And then in later years, more recently, my wife and I found out we were expecting our first child. And that changed me. It changed my perspective. It changed the way I looked at things. It made me start preparing for something that I knew was coming. And then, even more recent than that, she was born. And it changes your mindset. Those of you who have children, you know what I'm talking about. You know how it changes you. It's not about you any longer. It's not about you. It's about this little human that's in your care, that God has entrusted you with. And there are everyday things that we are changed by. Because the reality of it is extraordinary experiences change perspective. And what I mean by extraordinary is I mean unusual. I don't mean miraculous. I mean extraordinary experiences. I mean things that happen that change your life. Maybe for you, an extraordinary experience was the death of someone pivotal in your family. Maybe because death changes things. Death changes people. Death changes the way we think about life. And especially if it's someone you're close to. Maybe you lived in an area in a time of your life where there was a natural disaster like a hurricane. That'll change your perspective. Maybe the one we've all know that has changed our perspective, maybe even on the world, is 9/11. That changed our perspective, didn't it? It changed how we viewed people. It changed how we saw things. And sometimes fires, at least in California last year, was on fire. That changed your perspective. A whole town was burned to the ground in Northern California. That'll change your perspective on life. Extraordinary experiences change your life. They change your perspective. They change the way you see the world, because experiences that change us are not everyday experiences. They're not things we just have or do. They're things that come once in a while, periodically, that change our mindset, that change the way that we look at the world and the way that we look at people. So tonight I want to talk about one particular person, and you all know him to be the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul is an excellent example of someone whose perspective changed, not just for the world, but for himself when he encounters Jesus. See, Paul, here's the Paul we see at the end of Acts chapter 7. The Paul we see at the end of Acts chapter 7 views the church as people who are going to worship false and idol gods. And so he's dragging Christians out of their homes, and he's persecuting, he's killing people, because he thinks that it's going to keep God from doing bad things to the people of Israel. This is Paul's perspective. This is what Paul sees. The Jews are straying away from God again, and I need to get them back on track. See, because Paul's view, Paul's mindset, Paul's thinking is ordinary. He's a person who lives in a first century world. He's a Hebrew of Hebrews. He's an individual who is so ingrained in his traditions that there's no room for anything else. This is what has to be. This is how it must be. And the people who are following this Jesus, they're crazy. They're crazy. They're people who are just following Jesus because he's done something miraculous. Well, they claim, right, that he's risen from the grave. Isn't that the day? Today was one of the days that we talked about the resurrection. Isn't that a crazy claim? The Bible speaks of the crazy claim, but there's actual historical proof to put that up. But in Paul's mind, here's what he's thinking. There's no way that this happens. It's just people following a false god, dragging the people of God away from Israel. But his perspective changes when he meets Jesus. His whole life is turned around by one encounter, one thing. And he writes about it often in his letters. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at Galatians chapter 1, verses, we're actually going to look through 11 through 24. I put the wrong thing up there. But we're going to look at verses 11 through 24 because this account is amazing. And the letter he's writing to this group of Christians that are in Galatia are struggling with some problems. Not severe problems, but they're holding on to the traditions that Paul himself renounced to follow Jesus. Well, you have to be circumcised to be a Christian. It's kind of what we read in the second chapter. That's the big debate, and the one we find in Acts chapter 15. It's the big debate because we think that there's something. You have to be baptized plus circumcised to be a Christian. But Paul, as he builds his credibility in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, he tells the church in Galatia, look, me, Jew of Jews, Hebrew of Hebrews, if anyone should hold on to the traditions of our fathers, the traditions of the Jews, it should be me. It should be me because I was more zealous than anyone of my contemporaries. So look at Galatians chapter 1 and verse. We're going to start in verse 13 here. And this is where it really comes down to. He says, "For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it." Well, this is true. He says, you know this for a fact, that my former life in Judaism was not what it is now. And people remembered what I did to the church. And you understand where I was. Now understand where I'm going to be. He says, and I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age, among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. So what changed, Paul? What changed your perspective? What made you look at the world differently? Was it just an everyday encounter with someone talking to you, telling you about Jesus? It couldn't have been. It couldn't have been. It had to be something extraordinary. It had to be something unusual. It had to be something unique for Paul to change his entire life. And we're talking about a man who probably left everything. You know, you talk about following Jesus. We're talking about leaving every single thing behind that keeps you from being in a right relationship with God. That's what it means to follow Jesus. Everything. These people in the first century were giving up things that we wouldn't even dream to give up. They were giving up family. They were giving up friends. They were giving up work careers. They were doing things in order to follow Jesus that were beyond our wildest dreams. Things we wouldn't even think of. Things we wouldn't even begin to do. He says, look, this change that I made, look at how I was. Look at my character. I was zealous for God. I was doing what I thought was right. I was doing what I had been trained to do, to be zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But look what he says next. But when he who set me apart from my mother's womb, before I was born, who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me. You see, this is not something that just happens every day. Paul says, look, at the beginning of this, my God God set me apart before I was born. When I was in my mother's womb, he had this purpose for me. He had this identity for me that I didn't even know about. And he called me by his grace. And he was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach among the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with anyone. You see, he's building his credibility. You look at this chapter. He starts out very harshly in chapter 1. He starts talking about these ideas of my gospel is not, the gospel that I preach is not from man's gospel, right? It's nothing to do with man. And actually, in fact, in the entire book, the word man is a key word, and it links together these ideas that the gospel that Paul preaches, he received by revelation because God chose him to preach among the Gentiles. A man who was so zealous for his traditions. You know people in your life who you would never think could change? You never think would change? Well, they're too ingrained in what they do. They're too zealous for their religion. They would never change. They would never listen to me. They would never try to understand my perspective of the Bible. They would never try to understand me. They would, and maybe it is that we're looking at this the wrong way. Maybe it is that we're not looking at them for understand us, but for us to understand them. And so Paul does this. He says, I didn't consult with any flesh and blood. This is how you know that Paul is credible in what he does. The change in his life was so drastic, right, that people thought there's no way that this guy could be preaching the gospel that we're preaching. He persecuted the church. Look at verse 17. He says, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia, and I returned again to Damascus. So he starts telling us about this journey. He says, I didn't go up to Jerusalem where the rest of the apostles were. I didn't go up to consult with them and say, give me the doctrine that you're preaching. He says, I received it through a revelation. So when I tell you things, you need to listen to what I'm saying, because my whole life completely changed. Your life changed too. Your life changed from the way you once were to the way you are now. And there are things that have happened in your life that have molded and shaped you into the person that you are. Extraordinary things, unique things, things that aren't everyday or common things that happen to us. They changed you. They made you look at the world differently. They made you change your perspective on life. He says, look, I didn't go up there. He said, but I went away into Arabia and returned to Damascus. I went away from the place where I was once converted, where I could have gotten this doctrine, and then it might be shaky on what you believe when I tell you what I believe. Look at verse 18. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem or to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia. But I saw none of the other apostles except for James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. You see, there was a vibe when Paul's writing this letter that, well, we have no reason to believe Paul. What we're doing is right? And then he's going to go into chapter 2, and he's going to talk about the Jerusalem conference. And he's going to talk about this idea that when I went there, the people that had come down, they were telling us, well, you need to do this plus this to be a Christian. And Paul says, no, not in my perspective. Not in my view, because my whole life changed, and if anybody should be doing the things that you're doing, it should be me. It should be me, but I've dropped all these things. So believe what I'm telling you when I tell you this. Look at verse 21 and 22. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. There's a link of churches there. And Paul, as he's preaching, he's a radical man. We're not talking about someone who's just an ordinary person. We're not talking about somebody who just works in a factory or works at a grocery store or whatever normal people did in the first century. We're talking about a man who was a Pharisee. We're talking about a man who was ingrained in his tradition so much so that it was almost impossible to expect someone like this to change. I mean, you've seen the encounters with Jesus and the Pharisees. You see how they challenge Jesus and what he says and what he opposes? I mean, you see it all over and you think, well, how could these individuals change? And you would never know it. You would never guess it. You would never guess that Paul, of all people, in the network of churches that he's going to. But look at this last section that we're going to look at here. He says, they were only hearing, it said, he who used to persecute the church is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God because of me. You know anybody like that? You know anybody who spoke against God? Maybe at one time was an atheist or something of that nature. You know anybody who did that? You know anybody who was like that and who you said, no way, there's no way ever. And then all of a sudden at the switch of a button, they're changed and they're preaching the gospel. Really? What happened? Wow, that's amazing. That's incredible. This is an incredible story. Extraordinary experiences change perspective. The things that we see, the things that we hear, the conversations and the people we interact with change who we are. They change our DNA. They change the way that we look at the world. And that's what Paul is trying to get across to the church. He says, in order for you to understand what I'm about to tell you, you've got to change your perspective on the world. You've got to change your perspective of the church. And so, you think about this for a moment. Paul could have never changed the world if he'd never changed his perspective. You ever think about that? You ever think about people who you know who are really influential? I mean, people who, you may not know their past life, but man, they are just, they have influenced you so much in so many ways that you don't know how they could have ever lived a former life. Now, this is the type of person we're talking about with Paul. See, people in the church, they knew that Paul persecuted the church, but they would have never guessed, if they hadn't known who Paul was, that he persecuted the church. So here's kind of what I want you to take away from all of this, right? Our extraordinary experiences change our perspective, but before we can change the world, our perspective of the world has to change. And this is simple. I mean, this is such a simple idea that if we want the world to change, we too have got to change. We too have got to look at the world. We've got to look at people differently. We've got to experience people in a different manner. We can't look at people as just other people who interrupt our lives, right? Whose responsibility is it to bring people to Jesus? Whose responsibility is it? My responsibility? The preacher? Is it Cliff's responsibility? Is it the elder's responsibility? Or is it our responsibility? You don't know what type of person you're going to come and encounter with. Just one conversation can change the entire way of the church. It can change the entire world. One single person. Look at, for example, Peter and Andrew. Andrew hears about Jesus and he goes and gets Peter. And what does Peter do? He preaches in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost in front of thousands and thousands of people. And thousands of people are converted to Jesus. Who would have ever thought Peter could do that? Or how about this? How about Nicodemus in John chapter 3? We read of this conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus. And this conversation between this Pharisee who we would never think would change and this teacher. What was that? This teacher who we don't know much about. And at the end of the book of John, in John chapter 19 and verse 39, we see that Joseph of Arimathea has Nicodemus when he's burying Jesus. This man, Nicodemus, was so impacted by the conversation he had with Jesus that he's at the burial with Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus. I mean, you think about that for a minute. You think about a perspective change. I guarantee you that conversation changed Jesus' perspective. Before we can change the world, our perspective of the world has to change. Our perspective of people have to change. Our perspective as husbands have to change. Our perspective as members of the Lord's church has to change. The way we view people has to change in order for us to reach the people that need to be reached. Could you imagine, just for a minute, just imagine with me for a moment, and before I give you this, send you off with this lesson, imagine what the church would look like if we just took one person, if everybody in this room, and I'm sure you've heard this before, if everybody in this room just focused on one person, you know family, you have friends, you have people you work with, if you just focused on one person and said, well, I want to share with this person who Jesus really is. I want to impact their life in some way. I want to help them come to Jesus, and not for personal gain, not for selfishness, but because you know it's your responsibility as a Christian to share the good news with other people. You have something extraordinary. You have something incredible. You have a message that is so good for the world to hear. And it can change someone's life if you use it the way it's intended to be used. If you share it with people, if you take your fears out of perspective and you start helping people learn Jesus. So I want to challenge you tonight with this, and it's something very simple, and it can change people's world. It can change an individual's world. I want you, just for a week, I just want you to commit to one thing. I want you to do something good for someone you know or don't know every day this week. I want you to find something you can do. It could be something as simple as buying a meal for somebody, or it could be something like helping someone with gas. It doesn't have to be anything a lot. It doesn't have to be anything big. It doesn't have to be anything major. But what you do for one individual can change their life, and it can change the church, and it can change the way we grow, and it can change our perspective of people. One act of random kindness. Doesn't matter who it is. Someone you know, someone you don't know, helping someone move, it can change the way that we view the world. It can change our perspective of the church, because extraordinary experiences change our perspective. Before we can change the world, our perspective of the world must change. If you're here tonight and you have a need of some sort, if you want us to pray for you, if you want us to baptize you into Christ, this is an opportunity. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. Curtis is going to lead us in. Why don't you come forward as we stand and as we sing.